All right, greetings everybody, and welcome to my two-part lecture dealing with essentially 20th century China. On the board here it says 1900 to 1949, or 1989 rather, but we're going to stop today for this lecture at 1949 when Mao Zedong and the communists take power, and then the second lecture will look at the reign of Mao right through to the period of Deng Xiaoping, which will take us to the Tiananmen Square massacre of 1989. So what a remarkable 100 years they have had. You know, a lot of struggles. There's no question that the Chinese people have been pulled on a sort of a loop-de-loo of the ups and downs of incredibly impactful policies that have navigated the lives of millions of people. You know, one of the remarkable comments I've heard in the past is that if someone comes up to you in China and says to you, hey Eric, you're one in a million. Well, that means there's 1,300 people like you. So if you're in China, you've got to say 1 in a billion, and then you're real special. I say this just to kind of give us a perspective of the absolute mammoth size of China's population. 1.3 billion, pushing roughly nearly 25%, about 20% I would say would be more accurate. 20% of the world's population lives in China. India as well has a population of around 1.3 billion. So between those two countries, they make up almost half of the world's population. So one can only imagine what would be required to manage an economy of that size, the responsibility government has to ensure services to its people, to ensure food supplies, employment, medical, education. You know, it truly is a remarkable story. And China today, right now, we're in a very, very interesting time with China and its relationship with the United States. Certainly it being the epicenter, if you will, of the start of the coronavirus, which is currently causing a lot of problems in the United States. We're seeing sort of a resurgent racism and lashing out at even Chinese Americans, which is truly tragic that we're seeing this kind of thing. The Trump administration continues to go toe-to-toe with the Chinese authorities, and I just read in the paper today that online, that is anyway, that Donald Trump is planning on punishing the Chinese for being the birthplace of this coronavirus. To what extent, how that will manifest itself, we don't really know. So, but either way, for our purposes, we are going to go back and really kind of comb through the first half of the 20th century with China. And you know, they are such a key player in the world's economy today. Love them or hate them, we have to work with them. And despite the fact that they are essentially a one-party state, very rigid in many ways, there's also a strange element of economic openness there too. So it's that strange balance between, you have all the economic freedom you want in China, but you have almost no political freedom. So, and I'll explain all those things as we go through it. Just some pictures. This is sort of classic socialist realism. That's a type of state-sponsored art that was really born out of the Soviet Union in the 20s and 30s, and in many ways during the 1960s, particularly during the Cultural Revolution period, we see a real heightened move towards this aggressive socialist realism type of artwork as well. So yeah, okay, let's move on. Let's go back though. Here's the interesting thing. By 1900 there were 400 million people in China, 80% of which were poor peasants ruled by the Manchu dynasty since the 1700s, and the Manchus enforced the wearing of pigtails as a sign of conquest and subservience. Okay, first part, 400 million. Think about that. 120 years ago, China had less than 1/3 of the population it has now. It is now 1.3 billion. They have grown threefold in 120 years, which really, and those kind of patterns we've seen throughout the world as well. There was, what I find really remarkable about civilizations all over, whether you're looking at feudal Europe or you're looking at ancient Egypt or any other societies, there's always these sort of power structures, and there's always these labels to suggest what your place is within society. So sort of wearing those pigtails was kind of a sign that that is your place, You need to respect your place, almost like a caste, like in India, the caste system. So it's very interesting. Under the emperors, mandarins governed China who believed in custom and tradition, and they were bound by Confucian conservatism. So Confucianism goes back thousands of years. In fact, China, I believe, has the oldest continuous recorded history, which I believe is about 5,000 years. So, they've got a lot in their past that is really interesting to look at. The top of society were usually educated officials, landowners, and wealthy merchants. Sounds like feudal Europe. The Boxer Rebellion of 1900-1901 was largely a Chinese reaction to European control and influence in their society, especially the treaty ports. Okay. One of the things that makes the Chinese experience with imperialism unique is that they weren't just colonized by one country, that many European countries had a piece of the Chinese pie. And if you look at this picture here, this would have been taken, well, I'm assuming that this is Queen Victoria, this is looking like the Kaiser, maybe Tsar Nicholas II, Japan, France, and here's the Chinese citizens standing in the back going, wait a second here, what are you guys doing carving this up? So colonialism was particularly humiliating, with everybody getting their piece of pie. The Boxer Rebellion was kind of a reaction against this. The Boxers were a group, a society called the Society for Harmonious Fists. So they were well trained in martial arts and boxing, I believe, and they lash out against anything. They burn down European buildings, they burn down churches, they execute officials, European officials, and it's just kind of this lashing out against European colonialism. What's interesting is the rebellion lasts for 55 days in Peking. Peking is now Beijing, and was put down by the Russians and Japanese troops. Isn't that interestingly ironic? Those two nations, of course, would go to war against each other just 5 years later, but they were the two main players in suppressing this rebellion. So, the problem with rebellions, and the difference between a rebellion and a revolution is when the overthrow of a government is achieved. A rebellion is when there's an attempt to overthrow, but it is not achieved. Like the 1837 rebellions in Upper Lower Canada, not successful. The Riel rebellions in Red River and in the Northwest, not successful. The Boxer Rebellion, not successful. The problem with rebellions is that usually what that means is that your occupier, or the very organization you're trying to overthrow, in this case the Europeans and the Japanese, would assert their influence more stridently after the rebellion. So when you rise up against your government, you always risk the possibility that if you are not successful in the overthrow, they are going to suppress you even further. So that's more or less what happens after the Boxer Rebellion. The Americans, of course, get involved in China too, although the language they use to support their interests isn't very colonial or imperialistic, although essentially that's what they're doing as well. They advocate something called the open door policy, right? Everybody should have the right to go in there and do business in China. So, all right, let's move on. Yeah, there we go. Okay. Well, in 1911, the leading Manchu dynasty gave way to the popularity of Sun Yat-sen, largely due to the failure of the emperor and mandarins to reform the government. I wanted to quickly point out the two different spellings here because this does confuse people. This is what is called the Wade-Gillies translation of Chinese names into English. Basically what happened, Wade-Gillies was the norm. That is how the English-speaking world, predominantly I think the English-speaking world, interpreted the spellings of Chinese names. Right? And that's a difficult thing when you're translating a language like English, certainly to like Japanese or Chinese or Korean. What happens is, I think it's in sort of the late 70s, early 80s, the Chinese government said, we are going to promote a new translation that meets the expectations of the Chinese government, that this is how you should be seeing and pronouncing the Chinese names. So that is known as pinyin. Pinyin, the newer version, Wade-Gillies, the older version. Sometimes I go back and forth between the two and I'll try to identify them. Someone like Chiang Kai-shek, his name is completely changed in the pinyin variation. And even Mao Zedong, there's variations as well. So I'll identify those as we go through it. But this would be the Wade-Gillies and this would be the pinyin. You know, Sun Yat-sen was a well-traveled lawyer, doctor actually. I think he had training in medicine as well. He lived in Hawaii for a while where he actually attended a missionary school. He learned to speak English, came back to China. You know, and here he is facing a dynasty that is out of touch, that is archaic. There's regional battles between various warlords in different sections of the country. And his big thing was advocating what he called his three principles. Now what's interesting, many different sources have these three principles laid out differently. I've seen one that has said nationalism, democracy, and socialism. Not quite that simplistic, it's a little bit more complicated. It's kind of like one would mean national unity, that is, we need to come together as a nation, as a people. One is sovereignty, and part of that idea of being sovereign is getting rid of and eliminating the colonial exploiters. So we need to be allowed and free to organize ourselves as a nation, free of outside influence. And lastly, equality. And he's talking kind of economic equality. So that's why oftentimes I think the word socialism, when we say nationalism, democracy, socialism, as his three principles. But yeah, he was talking about economic equality, that there would be a degree of equality amongst its citizens. Now, he wasn't talking about Marxism per se. He wasn't talking about Leninism or a rigid communist society at all. He was talking about, you know, having a social democracy, I guess would be the best way to put it. You certainly would allow the markets, you would allow the talented to rise to the surface, but in doing so, you also want to ensure that people are properly taken care of. So, because he was well educated, because he was relatively worldly, because he was anti-colonial, he became very popular with kind of the intellectual, the Mandarin class, if you will, of intellectual elite of China. During the war, Peking, okay, here we go. Peking is the Wade-Gillies, Beijing is pinyin. Okay, I will use Beijing a little later in the course, but or in the film. But Peking was the original version, the Wade-Gillies. During the war, Peking would declare war on Germany in 1917, hoping to rid China of foreign influence. Okay, the Germans had a colony in Shantung. Shantung province was controlled by German imperialists. In fact, the beer at Tsingtao, those of you that are beer aficionados, a very popular beer in China, tastes surprisingly like German beer because the original distilleries were German distilleries, and so some of the beer that comes out of China, particularly in the former Shantung area, would be very similar to German beer, but nonetheless. Peking decides to declare war on Germany in hopes that by doing so, the Allies, the other guys, the British, French, and the Americans hopefully, would then honor this declaration of war by saying, we appreciate everything you've done by declaring war on Germany, we're walking away from colonialism in China. However, what happens is that the part of the Versailles Treaty granted former German colonies in Shantung to be handed over to the Japanese, which Japan had captured from Germany in 1914. This leads to the May 4th movement and nationwide demonstrations. Okay, think about that for a second. Instead of the Shantung province being stripped from Germany and given back to its rightful people, the Chinese, it is handed over to the Japanese as a way of kind of saying, well, you know, Japan's a growing power, we're kind of going to have to appease them by letting them have Shantung. And the Chinese are saying, what on earth are you doing? We declared this war on Germany to get back our autonomy and national self-determination, if you will, to use a Wilsonian term, over Shantung province. But now the Japanese have been granted it by the Allies. So what this does do, though, is there's a sudden reaction, a national reaction to this decision by the Western Allies at Versailles. That now we see youth groups, students, workers coming together and protesting this on May 4th. It becomes the May 4th movement, and it leads to nationwide demonstrations. Now, the reason the May 4th movements are important is because it is the first time that we begin to see a cross sort of social class lines. It becomes something that all Chinese are upset about. You know, much like the Treaty of Versailles in Germany. You know, we talked about that it didn't matter whether you were a fascist or a socialist or a Democrat. Everyone hated the Treaty of Versailles. And that's how the Nazis were able to mobilize it. Same kind of thing here. Everybody hated the decision by the Western Allies to give Shantung to the Japanese. So May 4th is something that later Mao Zedong and the communists would kind of usurp in a way as their movement. It's part of the communist movement. And certainly there were young communists involved in May 4, but May 4 was much more eclectic in terms of the kind of people that were drawn towards it. For the first time, students, workers, teachers, and merchants protested together, solidifying the nation in a new sense of national pride and encouraged the Chinese to think and act together. This is a huge moment. And I believe today, May 4th is a national holiday as a result of this too. So, all right, let's move on. All right. So in 1921, the Chinese Communist Party is formed. Among its 9 initial members, just 9, Mao Zedong is one of the 9, a 28-year-old librarian. So I say there's young Mao Zedong. You'll notice it says Kuomintang. Kuomintang. You might be used to seeing the Kuomintang, which I believe is Kuomintang. Kuomintang. Kuomintang would be the Wade Gillies version. Kuomintang would be the Pinyin version. So once again, there's that. And this always confused me when I studied Chinese history in university. Was some books were Pinyins, some were Wade Gillies, some kind of mixed the two. I was going to university at the time when that transition was happening, so it was very confusing. I had to actually write up a chart for myself to figure out which was which and who was who. Some are close enough that you can figure it out, but some are so far apart that you'd have no idea there was a connection. Chiang Kai-shek, as I said earlier, was a major one. Jiang Jieshi is what it looks like on paper, but anyway. The USSR would send aid to the Kuomintang, there's the Kuomintang, Wade Gillies, and encourage the Communist Party to work with the Kuomintang. Sun was not a communist, but he worked with them. Sun Yat-sen, the leader of the Kuomintang at this time, the nationalist forces in China, was not a communist, we should be clear, but he was willing to take military aid, receive training from the Soviets, because the Soviets were interested in supporting anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, right? So it was that aspect that they were very keen to support. The Soviets were keen to support. Because the Communist Party was such a small party, the Soviet Union encouraged this small group of Communist Party officials and members, if you will, to say, hey, you guys go join the Kuomintang. They're kind of the main guys in China. They're the ones that are likely to be the most effective in ridding yourselves of a European presence. So go ahead and join with them. And very, very early on, the Chinese Communist Party held a certain degree of resentment about just merely connecting and aligning themselves with the Kuomintang. But they did as suggested, and they did just that. The USSR would train Sun soldiers and set up a military academy at Whampoa, provided arms and supplies, and encouraged Chinese communists to join the Kuomintang. In 1925, Sun Yat-sen would die, and one of his leading generals, Chiang Kai-shek, took power of the Kuomintang. Chiang had support from the wealthy business elements and who wanted a modern but capitalist China. Chiang Kai-shek was young, he had military roots, he was willing to tolerate the communist alliance, if you will, during Sun Yat-sen's leadership. But when Sun Yat-sen dies and Chiang Kai-shek becomes leader of China, he makes a decision that he wants to rid himself of that communist influence. And it's kind of ironic because of all the benefits that Chiang and the Kuomintang received from the Soviet Union. By 1927, the Kuomintang controlled all of China south of the Yangtze River. And in April, this is a huge, huge turning point. And this is why people say that the Chinese Civil War begins in 1927. In April, Chiang turns on the communists in Shanghai and 6,000 are killed. True tragedy. I mean, men and women are shot in the street. Now here's an interesting little anecdote about this Shanghai incident. And it didn't just happen in Shanghai, it spread all over the country, where communists are being rounded up and killed left and right. Many people that were part of the Communist Party were peasants, and most of them worked in the fields. They tilled the land. And many of them wore red scarves in solidarity of their unified connection with the Communist Party. And what happened is that many of these peasants who wore these handkerchiefs, the knot, where the knot is tied on the back of the neck, when it got really hot and they got sweaty, it would leave sort of a red stain on the back of their, of dye on the back of their neck. So what happens is, of course, they all remove their handkerchiefs when they go into the city, especially when the roundups are beginning. Members of Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang are running around grabbing people on the head, tipping them down, looking on the back of their neck. If they see the red dot, they shoot them in the head. Like, it was brutal, and they killed thousands this way. So it's unfortunate that that symbol of solidarity for the Chinese communists in Shanghai became a method by which the Kuomintang would execute them on the spot. So, Communist organizer Zhou Enlai, he'll figure very significantly later in Mao's government, fled Shanghai and connected with Mao Zedong, becoming his principal advisor in urban affairs. Zhou Enlai is sort of the urbane, sophisticated, soft-spoken, calm. He's almost kind of a foil later to Mao Zedong, particularly when we get to the Cultural Revolution. And he becomes sort of a more moderating force, if you will, in China during the Cultural Revolution. But in the early days, of course, Mao and Zhou became very close, and he becomes a very important part of Mao's rise to power and later his government. All right, let's see what we can do here. Come on, get my clicker to go. There he is. There's a very young Mao, both very young. So it is quite remarkable when you think of the impact of one human being on a society. And we've talked a lot about the leaders, the ones that particularly the ones that can rule absolutely, whether it be someone like Kaiser Wilhelm or Tsar Nicholas II or Lenin or Stalin, and certainly like Mao, that when you have that kind of influence and that kind of power, things can go bad real quick, as absolute power can corrupt. Absolutely, they say. But in the early days, Mao was a young idealist, impassioned by what he read in Marx and Lenin, and really wanted to build a better society in the early days. He was born to a wealthy family, though, in Hunan in 1893. And in 1913, he began a 5-year teacher program. He began a 5-year teacher program and ended up working in Peking Library, where he connected with professors, students, and intellectuals, many of whom were drawn to Marx and Lenin, especially when a Russian agent arrived in 1920 to form a communist party. So here's Mao, trained as a teacher, working in a library in Peking. He's constantly around teachers and intellectuals and students. Books are coming in and out. He's seeing all these books on Marx and Lenin. He's hearing all these intellectuals talk about it. And of course, he gets kind of drawn into it. So I think he was very much within that academic circle that allowed him to have exposure to these rather complex ideas. And of course, when the Russians come and help form this party, there he is, the right place at the right time. And as we said earlier, he's one of the original 9 members. The young party helped workers form unions and tried to improve the miserable working conditions for workers and peasants. So, the early communists were intellectuals, but they were actually willing to get out in the street and help people. If we're going to support these ideas and promote these ideas, then we need to lead by example. We can't just be pontificating from a podium. We need to actually be on the ground doing stuff. And that's what Mao was willing to do. The young Chinese Communist Party felt that some of the anti-foreign ideas of the Kuomintang were in line with the CCP, so they decided to align themselves with them. Also, because as I said earlier, the Soviet Union encouraged them to do so. So they kind of thought, well, there are differences, certainly ideological differences between the Kuomintang and the communists, but there's enough similarities that we can kind of make this happen. So, after the 1927 massacres in Shanghai, many fled to a mountain stronghold on the borders of Jung Zi and Hunan province and perfected guerrilla war tactics. So after the scattering of communists in Shanghai and the repression of communists all over the country, Mao and Zhou and others went to Hunan, which is kind of a mountainous area, or Jiangxi rather, and they called on all the communists who were now fleeing to join them up in this area where they hoped that they would be left alone. Would be far enough away from the urban centers, far enough away from the coastal ports that the Kuomintang and Chiang Kai-shek won't be interested in giving us grief anymore. Okay, there we go. All right, Jung Zi. So here is kind of an outline of China, and here is the Jung Zi Soviet right there. Okay, so this is where they begin to kind of congregate. Now the problem you might notice here is that it is a landlocked province. There's no coast. And some people were saying, well, Jiangxi's great because it's so mountain, it's a good place to practice guerrilla war tactics, but what happens if the Kuomintang encircles us? Right? Well, nobody thought that would actually happen. Communists would retreat to Jiangxi in 1931 and establish a Soviet and act as model soldiers to the peasants, contrary to the actions of the Kuomintang soldiers who often looted and raped. This is, I always say that the early Mao and the later Mao are almost two completely different people, and I'm going to explain later why, what happened to Mao and his mental state of mind and his policies of the late 50s and 60s. Because in many ways in the early days he was very, very progressive, and what he told his his People's Liberation Soldiers. Now, I don't know what point they were referred to as a People's Liberation Army, or if they called themselves the Red Army for a period, but let's just say the Communist Party soldiers at this time. He made very specific instruction that we need to lead by example. When we move throughout Jung Zi and around the periphery, every village we come to, we need to offer help, we need to explain things to them very clearly, we need to treat people respectfully, we need to win the minds and hearts of the peasants toward our cause. We cannot win support by looting and raping like the Kuomintang did. And the Kuomintang was more sort of a ragtag, loosely connected army that kind of worked more, small bands of men were just, saw it as an opportunity to act tough and to get away with things that maybe they couldn't get away with if they weren't in an army. So Mao Zedong really took note of that and said, we need to capitalize on that. Chiang continued his relentless pursuit of communists who were increasing their popularity with the peasants. So communists are growing. In 1934, Chiang encircles the communists in Jung Zi, and Mao felt he had no choice but to flee. So what happens is that the Kuomintang actually effectively quarantines Jung Zi by blocking all the potential exit routes. And what happens is Mao says, we have to get out of here. And so begins the remarkable long march. And of all the things that the Communist Party of China has tremendous pride in today, even more so than Mao himself, would be the incredible drama that was the Long March. And I'll explain what that was. In October 1934, the Communists fled the province and began the Long March. And essentially the Long March is a retreat. They are fleeing from Jung Zi, and they want to get up here, right? And what happens is, during this retreat, the Reds, or Communists, travel 6,000 miles through 18 mountain ranges, crossing 24 rivers at an average of 24 miles a day. The journey lasts a year. Think about that. They walked 24 miles a day through mountain ranges, through swamps, through forests, through crossed rivers. And they kept going and going. Now what happens is, as they retreat, they begin to make people aware of who they are and what their goal is, right, as they're retreating. And eventually what happens is they kind of, you can see that, I don't know how well you can see this map, they make quite a loop-de-loop-de-loo, and they end up here, which on this map is up here in a very northern part of the country called Yan'an in Shanxi province, right? Which are basically caves. They basically, when they arrive, they're living in caves. Now, you can imagine with this kind of travel schedule, there were those who were, who died. Of the 100,000 communists who migrated to Yan'an, one is the Pinyin, one is the Wei Gillies. Only 25,000 survived the journey. 75% of the communists either died or just fell away. Because not only were they retreating, but the Kuomintang was kind of chasing after them. So not only were they facing the elements, they were facing the Kuomintang as well. And when they get to Shanxi province in the caves of Yan'an, then the Kuomintang says, and finally, okay, they're way the heck up there, they can't cause us any grief anymore. It seemed that, the Kuomintang just couldn't believe the tenacity of the communists to survive. At Yan'an, the communists were in a better defensive position. They were up in the mountains in caves. And if the Kuomintang was going to go after them in Shanxi, in Yan'an, they'd be traveling uphill. So, all right. My clicker going here. Where are you? There you go. Okay. So, and during all this, and you got to consider, they flee Jung Zi, and this is right at the same time that the Japanese have invaded Manchuria in 1931. And then in 1937, the Japanese invade mainland China. So here's the Kuomintang and the communists going at it, And then out of nowhere, here come the Japanese. So during the Japanese occupation of Manchuria after 1931, Chiang did little to stop them but from Yan'an, Mao declares war on Japan. So Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang are so focused on eliminating the communist menace, so to speak, that they paid little attention to the invasion of the Japanese. Meanwhile, Mao from the caves of Yan'an declares war on Japan. So they look like the ones that have got their priorities straight. In 1937, Chiang Kai-shek was kidnapped by one of his generals who forced him to declare war on Japan. And then he encouraged an alliance between the Chinese Communist Party and the Kuomintang to repel the Japanese invasion of 1937. Many of Chiang Kai-shek's junior officers were appalled that he was not paying as close attention to the Japanese invasion as he could. So, and I don't know what the consequence was of this general who did this, but he basically said, you got to declare war on Japan or else. You know, you got to stop this obsession with the communists. We're going to need those guys to fight the Japanese. So what you need to do is declare war on Japan, and then we need to send overtures to Mao and say, look, we got to kind of come together and defeat this common enemy. As both fought the Japanese, they were now allies. Chiang's forces retreated to Chongqing, where he received aid from Britain and the USA by air from the Burma Road. So now the communists and the Kuomintang are allies, although the American support was for the Kuomintang officially, not so much of the communists in that alliance, and the war continues for the next 8 years. So the guerrilla tactics of the communists were far more successful than Chiang's, and Mao's popularity continued to grow. So what this alliance between the Kuomintang and the communists do for Mao is that it exposes many of the Kuomintang officers and soldiers, and also the communities under the Kuomintang's control, of the effectiveness of Chinese communist tactics. And what happens is they continue to grow in popularity during this alliance with the Kuomintang. In addition, the communists continued to help peasants by winning over the people with supplies, medicine, food, shelter, and education. This was an absolutely imperative part of what Mao said, and I mentioned this earlier in the Long March. This continues, right? Winning the hearts and minds. After the Japanese defeat in 1945, the civil war between the Chinese Communist Party and the Kuomintang starts up again. So here we go, my gosh. Now keep in mind, these guys started fighting in 1927. So, you know, by 1949, when the Civil War ends, they've been at each other's throat for 22 years. That slight reprieve when they came together to fight the Japanese, but, you know, it had been nothing but a constant fighting struggle. All right. Trouble with my clicker. Ah, there we go. Okay. Civil War. Again. By 1948, the Chinese Communist Party had 3 million supporters, about the same as the Kuomintang. Remember in 1920, they started out with 9 people. The Reds were much better trained and motivated, leading to victory in 1949. Their campaign to win over the peasants had worked brilliantly. So at the end of the day, when the Japanese presence is removed and World War II ends and that civil war resumes, the Chinese communists, under the leadership of Mao Zedong, had extremely and effectively maintained the growth and popularity of the communists, largely through the language of equality and largely through their good deeds, as well as their superior military tactics. So Chiang would flee with his followers to Taiwan, and Mao would begin the long and difficult road of unifying the mainland under communist control. So this is where the Taiwan, mainland China thing begins. Formosa, it used to be called. When Mao Zedong wins the civil war, leading figures, including Chiang Kai-shek, and leading elements of the Kuomintang go to Taiwan. And they declare themselves the Republic of China. We are the Republic. And then Mao in 1949 would declare that they were the People's Republic of China. Now in 1949, when Mao takes power, that's where the proof will have to be in the pudding, because I always say it's real easy being out of power and claiming all the wonderful things you're going to do for the people and for the economy once you get there, than it is to actually fulfill those promises. So Mao, who made many promises, was facing a country that had never ever been nationally unified in its history. And so he needed to begin a painstaking process of pulling this country together under the helm and leadership of Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party. So that, ladies and gentlemen, will be where we will stop today. If you go to part 2, I will begin right at 1949 and begin to talk about all the things that happened. And I'll tell you, Chinese history, particularly from 1949 to 1976, sees some great victories and sees some horrific tragedies at the same time. So please do join us for the second part of this lecture, which covers China 1949 to 1989. All right, I'm going to put new batteries in my clicker when I go to my next lecture. Thank you very much. We'll see you next time.